Yeah. Welcome to God with George Ortega and Joshua Bond. This is episode number 30. We're recording it on Friday, December 3rd, 2020 at 1:15 p.m. Eastern Time. And I thought it might be a good idea, rather than exclusively talking about God, to talk about our perception, relation to emotions about reactions to God, this interaction we have with God. So, and I guess it changes, from moment to moment, hour to hour, day to day. But so Joshua, start us off. What, when you think of God, what are you thinking? What are you feeling generally?
Yeah, George, I really like this idea. First of all, I think this is actually kind of the noble spiritual hero's journey that we all have to kind of do when we realize from a comparative religion standpoint that God means many different things to many different people, right? And many different religions, and most of them conflict. So for me, it's this realization of why does God exist and why does our understanding of God exist? And summoning God and spirits, but particularly God, has always been a way to connect with some emotional orientation to whatever the situation is going on, to bring some type of peace or faith or hope or love, or goodness or something like that. And for me, that's the real value in referring to God in various situations.
All right, but I want this to get personal, not to talk about like in theory how it should be or could be for everyone. For us as people, we have this kind of conception of God. For example, uh, several weeks ago, I was kind of like pissed at God. I mean, with this election and stuff going on, and then my brother dying and stuff, it was, difficult times. Now it seems like I'm much more grateful to God. I mean, like I've started working on my happiness again. Um, so, so that's, just, because like, so much of this understanding that there is a God is that we have a relationship to God, that we have reactions to God, to who God is, what God does and all. So, so again, try it again, and this time, just like what your personal relationship and interaction with God is.
Yeah, George. I think again, it comes down to the causality aspect of God, the causality nature. And for me personally, I'm still on the fence about whether we should abandon this whole God concept or not, because it's done so much evil and damage, and it's such an ambiguous, arbitrary word for so many people, or for in so many religions, right? And it's missed the mark extremely on the nature of reality, the causality of human behavior, of biology. Why couldn't have God given us access to this knowledge that we're biological beings and we don't have a free will, and instead allowed ideas of God to create these concepts of hell and human beings deserving to burn in hell for eternity for something they did or something they didn't even do, just being human, right? So that's one part of it. But to
All
practice
right, so it seems like your reaction to God is so strong that you're kind of like wondering whether we should have an interaction with God, whether we should like even keep the conception of God. So I mean, like, let's go with this. All right, let's shift gears. So if you're questioning, this concept of God, whether God exists, perhaps, I'm not really sure what you're saying with this, but to the extent that we don't use the word God, what do you propose we replace it with? And then the question would become, because it's, basically we'd be talking synonyms, I would imagine. What would be your reaction to whatever you're proposing we should refer to God as? How are your feelings about, that?
Well, it's very tricky because, let's just assume the whole God concept is a fallacy. And, we have to ask, why did we come up with that? And we look at other biases in the human psyche. And right off the bat, we realize that we can't just replace it, because the human psyche works off of this cultural narrative thing, right? So just like we have meat products now, or we have vegetarian products that aren't meat, but the grocery store still has to sell them as meat and milk, right? When that's not what they are. And there's just dozens and dozens. Human society, human culture can't just shift and change, right? And you see this across all areas. So I don't think any religion that just said, we're a religion but we don't believe in God, is going to do too well being successful. um, I think what needs to happen is a very careful understanding of an appreciation, new understanding, appreciation of consciousness, that gives us a new appreciation, understanding of God. And that's a little complicated, but I think we can do it.
All right, but I mean, like, we did episodes 3 through 7. This wasn't kind of like um, prophecy. We defined God, according like how we understand God is defined, our collective understanding, our consensus, and we kind of like reached the conclusion that God, is a logical necessity, that God can't but exist. So you seem to be challenging that. And if you believe that the God concept we have has too much baggage or whatever, again, propose, what do you're suggesting we may need to replace it with something. What do we replace it with? What would be your reaction to this entity? Can we communicate it? Does it have the same attributes? Because, like, not really sure what you're saying.
Well, one thing for anybody on the fence about this, and wanting to get clarity, is set some boundaries for yourself, right? So, that's the problem with human thinking, is what I call moral intelligence, right? So we have all of these negative things in history that belief in God have contributed, right? So at what point draw a line in the sand and say, okay, all the wars, all the crusades, inquisitions, all the terrorism, all the shame and negativity and all of that, it's tell me that that's not enough. And maybe it's not. I'm open, to that discussion. But at what point is it going to be enough? And what we find very quickly is, we don't have, none of us in our mind have this line in the sand where we draw, whether it be with, with politics, with education, with religion, with any of these institutions. And we should have that, because
All right,
otherwise tyranny is invited in.
Josh, I think the problem with what you're proposing is that you could use that same argument for humanity, for the human species. You could say, well, the human species has created so many wars, has, created so much carnage, because you can attribute it to human beings. And you could say, well, like, let's do away with humanity, with the human species. So,
we're gonna do. It seems like we're gonna do that on our own, anyways. But go
well,
ahead,
yeah,
George.
and that's actually part of understanding God. Yes, God has been here for eternity. We've been here for just a blip of that eternity. And it may be time. I mean, I've been reading climate change books that, we're nearing the end. I mean, we don't have the will or the morality to get over this, so we have to accept what's going on. But again, to dismiss or to deny the concept of God simply because God isn't as good as we'd want God to be, I'm not sure that that's a rational conclusion.
Well, it's. I mean, for one, human beings seem to have an inalienable right to exist. I think we should grant that. Now, all the versions of God, again, this contributes to that line in the sand of saying, you know, it's not that God. That's what we're doing with this show. I think is it's not that, you know, it's not that God is doing this. It's that versions, ideas of God are doing it, right? And so, in the broader sense, God is doing it, because God is the causality that creates all these false religions and manipulative politics, etc. You know, but a lot of it, if we look at that, a lot of that evolved from false ideas of God and not understanding causality and not understanding human nature and delusions of free will, right? So what we're doing with this show, I think, is creating this new version of God that will circumvent all of those evils inherent in the other versions of God.
Right. And I think one very, very important part of our kind of like correcting people's misconception of God is to acknowledge, and this is, it's not even, this is even in the Bible, in Isaiah. God talking to Isaiah says, I create good, I create evil. So like, we have to acknowledge, yes, God did all these horrible things, started all these horrible wars, any kind of pain you can think of, God's responsible, but God is also responsible for every good feeling, every positive thing that we've had. And that perhaps is that's a very important point I think people need to understand. People aren't comfortable with that kind of God. They need God to be, completely good, omnibenevolent, and that God just doesn't exist.
Yeah, George. And, I'd tease out that first of all, and I'd say it's much easier to sell that version, that fake version of God. So maybe it's not so much, I think people still do want that version of God, but maybe it's because we've been sold it for so many generations, because that's, if you got two churches competing and one's selling you this all good, all loving God, they're going to put the other church out of business. Right. And I think people are a lot more courageous intellectually, than they're given credit for. And if these concepts of the illusion of free will and causality, and for everything from environmentalism and global warming to economics to psychology, true causality, and you asked, and I didn't really answer you, what would I replace the old versions of God with, or the word God with, if we weren't going to use that? And it probably would be causality, cause and effect, if people had a better understanding of that, because we know from psychology our sense of reality is immensely illusory and doesn't see access to the true causality, which is very synonymous with God.
Okay, you mentioned something I wanted to address, that, you kind of like suggested that, for example, a church or religious institution that taught that God is all good would kind of like outsell, a religion that didn't. Historically, you're absolutely correct, but I'm wondering if we're not going into an era now where the young kids are rejecting church and religion because it doesn't make sense, because they understand that God is responsible for everything. So that may be changing. I don't know about calling God causality. So the thing with the conception of God that we have as God is that it personifies God. Causality is like a scientific process. It's kind of like, it's there's nothing personal about it, and I think as people we kind of like appreciate that personal connection to this grand personal being.
Yeah, I mean, there's a negative side to that too that I talk about, and that's, you know, one way to phrase it is many people's versions of God is closely tied with their trauma. And if and this is what's happened, unfortunately. It sounds bizarre, but if you really think about it, it'll really make sense. What's happened in the churches is they've talked about God in a way and not talked about science and psychology and true causality, and denied that allows people to go through painful events and suffering and struggle and just refer to it as God, instead of talking about it in a technical way that allows people access to solutions, right? I mean, the real cause of addiction, for instance, in most mental illnesses, this is what has caused them. And so it's a form of shadow projection, essentially.
Yeah, I'm wondering though whether, because basically I think what you're referring to, we have emotional, mental conditions, illnesses, and we also have physical conditions and illnesses. And it seems like that may not be in the direct domain of religion, that may be in the domain of science and medicine. And I certainly, religion can refer to it, can say, well, that God helps those who help themselves, and God has given us this science and medicine to treat, these, in other words, like, um, I think everybody understands that you can't pray to God for everything. You can't pray to God, to cook one's dinner for one. We have to do a lot of what we're doing ourselves. Um, So, but again, let's get, so like, however you're conceiving of God, I want to get to your reaction to it, like whether you could address it a causality, whatever. How do you feel about God, causality, whatever?
Yeah, I mean the feelings, the emotions, this is again, I might call God the evolution of consciousness, because from a perspective of the only way I can experience God is through my consciousness, because that's the only way we experience anything, at least this thing we refer to as consciousness, right? And to the extent that that has evolved or exists, the nature of that as it exists now, that's essentially synonymous with my ability to experience God and my experience to experience all of life. Um, so uh, now, so you know, this concept of God is, once we've done what we've done, kind of unmasks all of the, separate ourselves from many bad ideas about God or false ideas, then we're kind of left here. We're kind of left here struggling as we are in this conversation. But I think it's a noble one to kind of redefine it and re-experience it. And for me, it's a lot of frustration from that past, but a lot of hope for the future, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, I kind of like, I believe in my conception of God, naming God God and all, again, according to the wiki definition, it makes sense. Um, Now the thing is, like, all right, what I'm sensing is like, I could say, yes, I'm pissed at God. Why did God create pain? Why did God create suffering? Why does God, do anything? Why did God create a world that isn't perfectly good, perfectly happy? I'm upset with that. That's not a good. But on the other hand, I understand that God tends to, for most people, you know, give us more joy than pain, more happiness than suffering. So that's when I want to elicit from you, a personal reaction to however you conceive of this God, this reality.
Okay. Another analogy here, and I'll try to make it personal, is to view God as a technology, and our ability to have this consciousness of God as a technology that we're passing from one generation to the next. And if that's not making the lives of the next generation better, then it's a bad technology, or at least we're interacting with it bad. And the same thing could be applied to anything, capitalism or our smartphones or, computers, whatever. All right. And so we can adjust our views of the technology or how we interact with it to, leave a better world for the next generation. And if it's not doing that, that really should be the benchmark. And for me, I feel like, right now, so far, we're failing with this God technology, you know. But like you've said, the reason I'm doing this show and the reason I haven't completely given up on this concept is because it's a millions of years old in the evolution of consciousness. And I think it does have some potential to, be reincarnated essentially.
All right, so all right, if I can hear you correctly, God kind of, for example, gave us these fossil fuels, led us to believe, oh, these are so wonderful, we got so much energy, we can create an amazing world. Then all of a sudden we learn that, these fossil fuels are destroying civilization. And not only that, God as technology is doing that, but God is perhaps as a different form, isn't allowing us to fight it. Has us in denial, has us like too selfish and greedy and and indifferent to fight it, to do what we need to do. Uh, that's got to be extremely frustrating that this reality would be like this. Now, again, if I'm going to see this reality the way we addressing climate change, I'm going to say, yeah, all right, it doesn't seem so good, but in the long run, after, let's say, 1,000 years, I imagine things will be back to normal.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, back to normal one way if we're still here, or if we've gone extinct one way or the other, I guess, right? And I think with, you know, whether we're successful in this venture of um, giving a new vision of God and speaking about God in a new way, or we aren't. I think and the idea of God goes extinct because of it, or just gets, I mean, worst case, it as we're seeing a lot, the only churches that are growing are kind of the most extreme, radical, uh, hateful versions, unfortunately. Um, so I think that the future generation is going to get it, and they're going to I think they will be doing, if we, as we define God, I think they'll be doing God, whether they use the word or not. And so I think, it's beneficial to not lose the idea, the concept, and the relationship to God.
Right. And I guess, what our entire world is going through now, perhaps more so than in the past, is that we're staring down, an end of civilization, most probably. I mean, we may make it through, but, there's nothing in our politics, there's nothing in our psychology, in our history that would lead us to believe that we can summon the will and the courage and the wisdom to pull ourselves out of this. So that's an entirely different. I mean, I forgot we've extincted, I think, about 60% of the animals. We as human beings just destroyed this. And again, so it's not us, it's God, and that's got to evoke a powerful reaction, not just in us, but in people in general. And so that's one of the challenges of religion now, to come to terms with this, to accept it, to and look at it. Yeah.
Yeah, George, and it's kind of the same way with me, or the same way with that subject within me is like, it's hard to, it's hard to even evaluate it, knowing we have all these cognitive biases, because, so many of these books and authors and researchers, even, all of science really, but is biased and religiously minded, maybe not in the traditional sense, but they make a religion out of their science. And so, like just in my short lifetime, we've made massive improvements, and there's experts that are still saying there's no way we could even make enough improvements to save the world, and I don't know how much of that's true. Um, but again, I think, the unifying foundation between all these issues is kind of a moral issue or a spiritual issue. So I think they're all kind of valid and unified there.
Yeah. I just finished a book on climate change, the uninhabitable Earth. Devastating. It's I think it was published last year. It's just like, things don't look good. So then what happens? We come to terms with it. We say to ourselves, yeah, it doesn't look good for humanity. I mean, is it any different that humanity or civilization is ending? Is it any different than our lives end? I mean, we're here 100 years and we die, whatever, 80 years, 120, and we're gone. And so, but we accept that. We don't think about that every day. We don't bemoan that. Very many religious people who love God understand that. So I think we have to kind of apply that same kind of reasoning um, to God, notwithstanding, this ending of civilization.
Yeah. Yeah. How would you evaluate it? Like, knowing that we now realize that many many millions and millions of people have been convinced that their version of God is the one true God, and they knew that for a fact, and they felt that they actually had logical, rational reasons why that was true, and they really believed that. Lots of smart people that also did lots of great academic and scientific things are of the same persuasion. How do we assess that with climate change, for example? How do we, like, I mean, there, some countries now are predominantly electric cars. All of our light bulbs went from like incandescent halogen that were like 60 and 90 watts burning. Now they're like 3 watts burning LEDs. And we got wind farms. We've made all this progress. How do we know we haven't made a false god that's basically spreading a new version of sin or something with climate change?
All right, I'm not really sure I understood that. I just want to bring up a similar point, an adjacent point. Basically, let's say we take it at face value that God is not just good, God is also evil. That God punishes us and undeserved because we don't have a free will. God caused all this suffering, causing climate change. One very powerful reaction that I have is I ask myself, is it going to help me to get angry and stay angry with God? And I conclude no. So like, yes, God isn't perfect, but I accept God just like as imperfect, just as I accept my parents as imperfect as other people and all. So, but like, raise your question again, because I didn't really understand it this first time.
Well, it's kind of an elaborate question. Maybe we could save it for another episode. But it kind of does kind of go with what you just said. So when you decide it doesn't help to stay angry at God, and it, it's somewhat different than, staying angry at somebody who's living with you or your family. It's not a real person in the room. How does that, I'm curious how that changes your demeanor or changes your outlook or your happiness, when you feel like, you know, it's not going to do any good. I mean, I'm just curious how that plays out.
Yeah, well, that's a good question, because like when we become angry at ourselves, at other people, we, kind of like have the reasonable prospect that we can do things. If somebody's not treating us well, we talk to them, we explain things to them, or or if we're angry at ourselves, we basically, think about it and make changes. Now with God, you know, all we can do is, we're angry with God to say, what are you doing, God? Ask, and God ask God to stop doing what God is doing. That's the limit of our influence on God. And so we have to be, like a lot of times, yeah, I can't fathom, again, like this whole thing of pain and suffering and evil. I just don't understand that at all. And I ask God, you know, why would you create a world like, who knows? Maybe many people have been asking the God the same question. And maybe that is leading to, like, maybe we're seeing this whole civilization collapse in an entirely wrong way. Maybe, for example, when we die, we go to a much better place. When civilization is no longer here, everyone's much better off.
Yeah, I mean, and certainly in the shorter interim, we kind of had this false notion that materialism would make us happy. And if we run out of resources and can't afford much materialism, then, maybe we'll learn more true ways to be happy, I think is one hopeful thing for it. We got about 40 seconds left. Um, yeah, the concept of God and the reality of God and being mad at that reality, that causality. I guess one thing that comes to mind is, like when my car is broken or I'm sick and it's inconvenient and I'm just mad that it's happening, it's not very productive. But when I finally get over the being mad or being inconvenienced and say, okay, let's do something about it. Let's work on the car. Or let's take better care of myself. Then we find real solutions. And I think that's what this idea of God's all about. And we'll see you tomorrow on The God Show.